In the summer of 2021, a team of archaeologists working a few miles outside Salisbury, England, made a discovery so unsettling that several members of the team reportedly refused to continue the excavation. They had been mapping the landscape around Stonehenge using ground-penetrating radar, standard work, routine scans of a field that had been studied hundreds of times before, but the machine started returning readings that made no sense. Readings that suggested something enormous was sitting beneath the surface. Something that had been sitting there, completely undisturbed, for longer than anyone had thought possible. They dug carefully, and what they found was not a burial mound. It was not a Roman ruin. It was not a medieval foundation. What they found was a series of massive underground shafts, each one wider than a house, arranged in a perfect geometric pattern around the site of Stonehenge. The shafts were enormous. Some measured over 5 meters across and 10 meters deep, and they were arranged with a precision that suggested whoever built them understood geometry, surveying, and long-distance planning at a level that should not have existed at the time. Carbon dating placed the construction of these shafts at roughly 4,500 years ago, which sounds recent until you realize that puts them several centuries older than the earliest phases of Stonehenge itself. And then came the measurement that changed everything. The shafts form a circle, a massive, near-perfect circle with a diameter of roughly 2 miles, and at the exact geometric center of that circle sits Stonehenge. Stonehenge was not the beginning. Stonehenge was built inside something that already existed, something older, something deliberately, mathematically, precisely constructed around a point in the landscape that someone had already decided was sacred or significant, or both, for reasons we still do not understand. This is the story of what lies beneath Stonehenge, and the more we excavate, the less certain we become about everything we thought we knew. Because the real mystery is not the stones. The real mystery is what came before them. The plain of Salisbury in southern England looks at first glance like unremarkable countryside. Rolling hills, chalk downland, the kind of landscape that exists in thousands of places across Britain. Green in summer, grey in winter, bisected by roads that have been there, in one form or another, for centuries. But this landscape is not ordinary. It never has been. Within a roughly 10-mile radius of Stonehenge, archaeologists have identified over 700 separate ancient monuments, burial mounds, earthwork enclosures, processional avenues, stone circles, timber circles, henges of all sizes, from modest rings a few meters across to colossal earthwork constructions that would have taken years to complete. This is not a landscape with one monument on it. This is a landscape that was itself transformed into a monument. Over and over again, across thousands of years, people returned to this particular piece of land and built something new. Something that referenced what was already there. Something that added to a place that was already considered by the people who lived here to be somewhere deeply, fundamentally different from everywhere else. The question archaeologists have been asking for over a century is simple. Why? Why here? What is it about this specific stretch of chalk downland, this particular arrangement of hills and valleys, this exact spot on the surface of Britain, that generation after generation of prehistoric people treated as the most important place in their world? The answers, it turns out, were hidden underground, not in the foundations of the standing stones, but in the landscape around them, in features so large that nobody thought to look for them, in a scale of construction so enormous that the technology required to find it simply did not exist until the 21st century. What ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR scanning, and systematic magnetometry have revealed over the last 2 decades is a site that is almost incomprehensible in its complexity. A place where the oldest features are not the most visible ones, where what you can see from the road is, in every meaningful sense, the least interesting part of what is actually there. The shafts came first, then the avenues, then the earthwork enclosures, then, finally, the stones. Each phase of construction built on the memory of what came before, referencing it, incorporating it, treating the accumulated history of the place as the raw material from which something new was made. And the further back we push, the stranger it becomes. To understand what was found beneath Stonehenge, you need to understand how it was found, because the story of the discovery is as remarkable as the discovery itself. For most of the 20th century, archaeology at Stonehenge meant digging holes, trenches cut through the turf, careful removal of soil layer by layer, meticulous recording of what was found where. This approach produced real knowledge. It told us when the stones were erected, how they were moved, what activities took place inside the monument. But it also had a fundamental limitation. You can only dig where you decide to dig. And if the feature you are looking for is 50 meters from where you put your trench, you will never find it. Non-invasive survey technology changed everything. Ground-penetrating radar sends pulses of electromagnetic energy into the ground and records how they bounce back. Different materials reflect differently. Stone reflects differently from soil. Buried pits filled with disturbed earth reflect differently from undisturbed chalk. Done systematically, across a large enough area, GPR builds up a three-dimensional picture of what is underground without anyone having to dig a single hole. The Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project, which ran from 2010 to 2014 and was led by researchers from the University of Birmingham and the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute in Vienna, deployed this technology across an area of roughly 12 square kilometers around Stonehenge. They walked the fields with GPR rigs. They flew aircraft equipped with airborne laser scanning. They used magnetometry to detect subtle variations in the magnetic properties of the soil, variations that reveal ancient pits and ditches that have long since filled in. The results were extraordinary. In 4 years of survey, they identified over 17 previously unknown monuments beneath the fields around Stonehenge. They found the remains of massive timber buildings. They found long-forgotten burial mounds. They found a huge stone monument buried under the surface that nobody had known was there. But the shafts came later. The Durrington shafts, as they are now known, were discovered in 2019 and published in 2020. A team led by Professor Vince Gaffney from the University of Bradford had been conducting a wider survey of the landscape and noticed something anomalous in the radar. Returns from a field to the northeast of Stonehenge. There were circular features in the data, large ones, more than 30 of them, arranged in a pattern that could not be natural. They investigated. They dug test trenches. They confirmed what the radar had suggested. The shafts were real, and their arrangement was deliberate. The full picture, which took another year of survey work to establish, showed that the shafts formed an arc around a site called Durrington Walls, one of the largest henge monuments in Britain. When the arc was extended to a full circle, the geometry became clear. The circle of shafts had a diameter of roughly 2 miles, and its centre was Stonehenge. Professor Gaffney described it as the largest prehistoric monument ever found in Britain. His colleague, Professor Wolfgang Neubauer, called it a superhenge, a construction project so massive that it dwarfed anything else from the period. The shafts were not just large, they were precisely placed. The spacing between them was consistent. The geometry was deliberate. Whatever they were for, they were not the result of casual or improvised work. They represented an enormous investment of labour, carried out according to a plan, by people who understood how to survey large distances and maintain accurate measurements across terrain. People, in other words, who were considerably more sophisticated than the popular image of Stonehenge builders tends to suggest. Here is what we actually know about the people who built Stonehenge. They were farmers. They arrived in Britain roughly 6,000 years ago, migrating from the continent, bringing with them domesticated cattle and sheep, seed grain for crops, and a set of social practices and beliefs that included, prominently, the construction of large communal monuments. These were not small-scale communities. Isotope analysis of human remains from the period suggests that people were travelling to the Stonehenge area from considerable distances, from what is now Wales, from Scotland, from continental Europe. The site was already, thousands of years before the great stones were raised, a place of regional and perhaps continental significance. They had no metal tools, no wheel, no written language, no system of measurement that we can identify. And yet they built things that required all of these things, or something functionally equivalent to them. The bluestones that make up part of Stonehenge were quarried in the Preseli Hills of Wales, roughly 240 miles away. Moving them to Salisbury Plain required either overland transport across difficult terrain or a sea voyage around the southwest coast of Britain. Both options required boats or sledges or rollers or some combination of all three. They required coordinated labor across large distances. They required someone or something that could organize and maintain a project across multiple generations, because the construction of Stonehenge was not accomplished in a single lifetime. The sarsen stones, the massive grey sandstone uprights that form the familiar silhouette, came from Marlborough Downs, roughly 25 miles to the north. Each one weighs between 20 and 30 tons. Moving them required sustained collective effort on a scale that implies either a very large workforce or a very long time, or both. And now we know they were doing all of this while simultaneously maintaining a 2-mile diameter circle of massive underground shafts in the landscape around the monument, shafts that they dug, presumably, by hand. The scale of human effort represented by the Stonehenge complex is, when you add it all up, staggering. And it raises a question that archaeologists have been struggling to answer ever since the shafts were discovered. What were they for? The most straightforward answer to the question of what the shafts were for is also, in some ways, the most interesting one. Nobody knows. The shafts do not contain obvious depositions. They were not filled with offerings or artifacts in the way that ritual pits at other sites often are. They appear to have been dug and then left open, at least for a period, before gradually filling with soil. Several theories have been proposed. The first is boundary marking. The circle of shafts may have defined a sacred precinct around the central monuments, a boundary that communicated to anyone approaching from outside that they were entering a special, perhaps restricted zone. The deliberate geometry of the arrangement supports this reading. This was a defined space with a defined edge. The second theory is astronomical alignment. Stonehenge itself is famously aligned with the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset. Several researchers have proposed that the shafts may have formed part of an extended astronomical observation system, their positions reflecting celestial measurements taken across the wider landscape. The geometry of the circle, if this theory is correct, may encode information about the movements of the sun or moon. The third theory, and perhaps the most evocative, is that the shafts were simply too large to cross, that they functioned as a physical barrier, a massive circular ditch that prevented livestock or people from approaching the central monuments without permission. The scale of this barrier, if it was indeed a barrier, would have made it visible from a considerable distance and would have required significant labor to circumvent. None of these theories has been conclusively established. Each has evidence in its favor and difficulties to explain. And the honest answer is that we are dealing with a society that left no written records, no explanatory texts, no priest's accounts of what the monument meant or what the shafts were for. We are reading the landscape as a text written in a language we are still learning to decipher. But the shafts are not the oldest thing. This is where the story becomes genuinely strange. In 2016, archaeologists working near Stonehenge discovered evidence of a wooden structure that predated everything else at the site by a considerable margin. The post holes they found, filled with the decayed remnants of massive timber posts, were carbon dated to around 8,000 years ago. 8,000 years ago. This is roughly 3,000 years before the first phase of Stonehenge was constructed. It is roughly 2,000 years before the introduction of farming in Britain. In 8000 BCE, the people of Britain were hunter-gatherers, mobile foragers who followed herds of animals across a landscape that was, in much of northern Europe, only recently emerged from the last ice age. And yet, at this specific location, these hunter-gatherers erected massive timber posts. The posts were enormous. Analysis of the post holes suggests they were made from pine trunks several meters tall and perhaps a meter or more in diameter. Raising them would have required coordinated effort from a substantial group of people. Maintaining them, if they were maintained at all, would have required return visits to the same location over generations. Why did mobile foragers, people who left almost no other traces in the British landscape, build a large timber monument at this particular spot? The most compelling answer, and it is an answer that reshapes everything we thought we knew about the prehistory of Britain, is that this spot was already special before any monument was built here. That something about the natural landscape of the Salisbury Plain drew people to this place long before the first stone was raised or the first earthwork was dug. What that something was remains a matter of debate, but several researchers have pointed to a feature of the local geology that may hold the key. The chalk downland of Salisbury Plain is cut in several places by periglacial stripes. These are natural features formed during the last ice age when freeze-thaw cycles in the soil created parallel ridges and troughs aligned roughly northeast to southwest in this part of the landscape. These ridges and troughs are not random. Their alignment at Stonehenge happens to correspond almost exactly with the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset. In other words, the natural landscape was already aligned with the major solar events of the year before anyone built anything here. The land itself, shaped by glacial processes, thousands of years before the first human arrived in Britain, pointed toward the solstices. Mike Parker Pearson, one of the world's leading authorities on Stonehenge, has proposed that this natural alignment may be the fundamental reason why people began treating this location as sacred. If you were a prehistoric person, living in a world where the movements of the sun governed everything, the seasons, the length of days, the timing of planting and harvest, the great rhythms of life and death, and you encountered a landscape that was naturally, visibly aligned with the sun's most dramatic moments of the year, that landscape would have seemed extraordinary, chosen, significant in ways that transcended ordinary human experience. The monument on this reading was not created, it was discovered. Someone, at some point in the deep past, noticed that the land itself was oriented toward the sun, and that discovery, passed down through generations, became the foundation of everything that was built here afterward. The timber posts of 8000 BCE may represent the first response to that discovery. A group of hunter-gatherers, perhaps returning to this location seasonally as part of their annual movement across the landscape, erected markers at a place that their tradition had already identified as significant. Not to create a sacred site, but to acknowledge one that already existed. And then, over the following millennia, the acknowledgement grew. The first phase of Stonehenge, the Stonehenge that archaeologists call Stonehenge I, was constructed around 3000 BCE. It consisted of a large circular earthwork, a bank and ditch, roughly 100 meters in diameter, with a series of pits inside it called the Aubrey Holes, after the 17th century antiquarian John Aubrey, who first identified them. The Aubrey Holes, it turned out, contained human remains, cremated bones deposited over several centuries of at least 58 individuals. This was a cemetery, one of the earliest, and for a long time one of the largest, in Britain. But it was not only a cemetery. The earthwork itself, the bank and the ditch, was oriented to allow a clear sightline toward the midsummer sunrise from the centre of the monument. The alignment was deliberate. The builders of Stonehenge, I knew exactly where the sun rose on the longest day of the year, and they oriented their monument accordingly. They were, in other words, doing exactly what the natural landscape had always seemed to do. They were pointing at the sun. Between 3000 BCE and 2500 BCE, the site was modified repeatedly. New structures were added and removed. Timber arrangements appeared inside the earthwork. Evidence suggests that the site was used for elaborate rituals connected with the dead: feasting, cremation, the interment of remains. Then, around 2500 BCE, something changed dramatically. The bluestones arrived from Wales, and shortly afterward, the massive sarsen stones were hauled from Marlborough Downs. Stonehenge, as most people picture it, the great upright stones with their lintels, the distinctive horseshoe arrangement at the centre, was built in this phase over a period of roughly 500 years, between about 2500 BCE and 2000 BCE. Why the change? Why, after 500 years of timber and earthwork, did the builders suddenly decide to bring stone from Wales and from 25 miles away? The answer, remarkably, may lie in the bones. Analysis of human remains from the early phases of Stonehenge showed something unexpected. The people buried here in the centuries before the stones arrived were not, in the main, local people. Their isotope ratios, the chemical signatures recorded in their teeth and bones during childhood, reflecting the geology of the water and food they consumed, pointed to origins in Western Britain, in Wales, in Scotland, in places far from Salisbury Plain. Stonehenge, even in its earliest phases, was a destination. People came here from great distances to be buried. And then, in the later phases, they came for another reason. Evidence of massive feasting events has been found at Dorrington Walls, the large henge monument that stood 2 miles northeast of Stonehenge. The animal bones recovered from this site, dating to around 2500 BCE, represent the largest assemblage of feasting remains from prehistoric Britain. Tens of thousands of cattle and pig bones, representing hundreds of animals, consumed over what appear to have been repeated large-scale gatherings. Parker Pearson has argued that Stonehenge and Dorrington Walls formed a complementary pair. Stonehenge was the domain of the dead, a permanent stone monument to permanence and ancestral memory. Dorrington Walls was the domain of the living, a place where the wood and earth of temporary structures reflected the transience of human life. Between them ran an avenue, a processional route connecting the two worlds, aligned with the midwinter sunrise and the midsummer sunset. The living feasted at Dorrington Walls. Then they walked the avenue to Stonehenge, where the dead were kept. This is the landscape of a society profoundly concerned with the relationship between the living and the dead, between permanence and impermanence, between the eternal cycles of the sun and the brief, fragile span of a human life. And now we know that this landscape was enclosed, defined, bounded by a circle of massive shafts that someone dug by hand 2 miles out from the centre. The shafts defined the boundary of a world. Inside the boundary, the dead, the stones, the ancestors, the solstice alignments, the accumulated memory of thousands of years of ritual and reverence. Outside the boundary, everything else, the ordinary world, the world of daily life and seasonal work and cattle and fields. The people who dug those shafts were not just creating a monument, they were creating a cosmos, a structured, bounded universe with a sacred center and a defined edge, oriented toward the sun, populated by the bones of their ancestors. Now let us talk about what was found inside the shafts, because this is where the story takes another unexpected turn. When archaeologists excavated test sections of the Durrington shafts, they found, in addition to the expected fill of soil and chalk rubble, something else. At the bases of several shafts and in the material packed into the lower sections, they found worked flint. Not the casual flint debris that accumulates when people make tools, deliberate, carefully worked pieces. And they found animal bones. The bones were not random, they were selected, cattle bones primarily, and they were placed in specific locations within the shaft fills in ways that suggest deliberate deposition rather than casual disposal. This is a pattern that archaeologists recognize from other sites across prehistoric Britain and Europe. Structured deposits, objects and materials placed in pits and ditches, not as refuse, but as offerings. Deposits that communicate something, a negotiation with the powers beneath the ground, perhaps, a marking of a boundary between the world above and whatever was imagined to exist below. The people who built the Durrington shafts were not just digging holes for practical purposes. They were creating points of contact between the surface world and what lay beneath it. They were, in the vocabulary of their own cosmology, opening the earth. What they imagined the earth to contain, we cannot know with certainty. But the pattern of deposits, the selection of materials, the careful placement of bones at the bases of massive pits, all of this suggests a worldview in which the ground itself was not inert, in which digging deep into the chalk was not neutral, in which certain places and certain depths required acknowledgement. This is consistent with what we know about prehistoric cosmology more broadly. Across ancient Europe, the world was understood in vertical terms. The sky above was one realm. The earth below was another. The surface, where humans lived, was the boundary between them. Monuments that penetrated the earth, pits, shafts, wells, were places where the boundary could be crossed or negotiated. Stonehenge sits at the centre of a landscape full of such boundaries. The great ditch of the original monument, the Aubrey holes, the Y and Z holes, a series of pits dug in later phases of construction whose purpose has never been fully understood. And now, the massive shafts, 2 miles out, enclosing the whole complex in a circle of opened earth. The builders of Stonehenge were not simply engineers. They were cosmologists. And the landscape they created was a physical representation of the universe as they understood it. There is another discovery beneath Stonehenge that most people have never heard of. It predates the shaft's discovery by several years, and in some ways it is even more disorienting. In 2008, researchers using geophysical survey equipment beneath the floor of the monument itself, inside the circle of standing stones, found evidence of a large timber structure, a circle of post holes, much larger than the standing stone circle, with the posts arranged in a pattern that suggested that a massive roofed building. The building was not there when the stones were raised. It predated the stones, and unlike the stone monument it preceded, it appears to have been enclosed, covered, an interior space. Stonehenge, in other words, may have been preceded by a large building, not a circle of posts in an open field, but something with walls and a roof. A structure designed to create interior space, to separate inside from outside, to define a boundary between those who were within and the wider world without. The implications of this are significant. The standard narrative of Stonehenge as an open-air solar observatory, a place where large crowds gathered on solstice mornings to watch the sunrise, align with the heel stone, does not fit particularly well with a predecessor structure that appears to have been enclosed. Enclosed structures are not observatories. They are places of initiation, perhaps, or ceremony, or restricted access. The historian Ronald Hutton, who has written extensively about the history of Stonehenge, has noted that the transition from enclosed timber structures to open stone monuments may represent a fundamental shift in religious practice, a move from esoteric, restricted ritual conducted by specialists inside a building to communal public ceremony conducted in an open monument that anyone could approach. The stones on this reading represent democratization, a monument for everyone, oriented toward the sun that belonged to everyone, replacing a building that may have belonged only to the few. Let us step back from the specific discoveries and consider the larger picture that is emerging. What we are dealing with at Stonehenge is not a single monument, but a sacred landscape, a complex, multi-layered, continuously evolving religious and commemorative site that was in active use for at least 5,000 years and that drew on a tradition of place significance stretching back another 3,000 years before that. In 8000 BCE, hunter-gatherers erected timber posts at a location whose natural alignment with the solstices had, presumably, already made it significant for generations. In 3500 BCE, the first earthwork was dug, a boundary was created, a cemetery was established. The dead began to accumulate. In 2500 BCE, the stones arrived, bluestones from Wales, sarsen from Marlborough Downs, a massive engineering project that reorganized the monument and, presumably, the meaning attributed to it. And throughout this period, the landscape around the central monuments was being worked, modified, structured. Avenues were laid out, earthworks were constructed, and at some point around 2500 BCE, the massive circle of shafts was dug, enclosing the entire complex within a defined boundary 2 miles across. This is not the work of a primitive society. This is the work of a society with deep traditions, sophisticated cosmological beliefs, and the organizational capacity to sustain multi-generational construction projects across a large landscape. A society that thought about the world in complex ways and expressed those thoughts in stone and earth and carefully placed deposits of bone and flint. The question of why this particular society and this particular landscape is so poorly understood is partly a matter of the evidence that survives, and partly a matter of how we have traditionally thought about the people of prehistoric Britain. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, the peoples of prehistoric Britain were imagined as primitive, less sophisticated than their counterparts in Egypt or Mesopotamia, building cruder monuments, living simpler lives. Stonehenge was treated as impressive for what it was, a structure built by people without metal tools. But the ambition of the comparison was always with what was being built simultaneously in the ancient Near East. The pyramids at Giza, under construction at roughly the same time as the final phase of Stonehenge, the cities of Mesopotamia, the written records of Egypt. But this comparison is, in an important sense, misleading. The builders of Stonehenge did not need writing to sustain a complex tradition across thousands of years. They did not need metal to move 30-ton stones. They did not need cities to organize large-scale collective labor. They had something else instead. They had the landscape itself, a landscape that had been continuously modified, marked, and interpreted for 5,000 years. A landscape in which the memory of past actions was embedded in the earth, visible to anyone who knew how to read it. Every earthwork, every stone circle, every avenue and burial mound was a text, a record of what had been done here, by whom, and when. The people of Stonehenge did not need libraries, because they lived inside one. The Stonehenge we see today is a ruin. Of that, there can be no doubt. Many of the original stones are missing, others have fallen. The lintels that connected the great uprights, The defining feature of Stonehenge that distinguishes it from every other megalithic monument in Britain are mostly gone. What stands today is perhaps a third of what once stood. But even in its ruined state, the monument retains a power that is difficult to account for rationally. People who visit Stonehenge, millions of them every year, consistently report something that goes beyond aesthetic appreciation. A sense of being in the presence of something much older than themselves. A feeling of weight, of accumulated time, of a significance that is felt rather than understood. This reaction is not, it turns out, arbitrary. It is a response to something real. The stones are old. Their age is not a metaphor or an approximation. The sarsen stones have been standing in roughly their present positions for 4,000 years. The chalk beneath them has been ritually significant for 8,000 years. The landscape around them has been continuously used, interpreted, and modified for 5,000 years. Standing inside Stonehenge, you are standing inside a tradition that stretches back further than any other tradition in the British Isles. Further back, in fact, than almost any continuous tradition anywhere in the world. The people who dug the first ditch here were contemporaries of the people who built the first cities of Mesopotamia. The people who raised the sarsen stones were contemporaries of the builders of the pyramids, and the people who dug the massive shafts 2 miles out from the center were doing so at a time when the great civilizations of the ancient Near East were already in full flower. And they left no cities, no writing, no gold, only the landscape, only the stones, only the carefully placed bones of their dead and the massive, precise circles of their sacred geography. There is a discovery that has not yet made headlines in the way that the Dorrington shafts did, but which may ultimately prove to be more significant. In 2023, a research team from the University of Southampton, working in collaboration with English Heritage, published the results of a systematic analysis of the ground beneath the stones themselves, using a new generation of ground-penetrating radar equipment capable of much higher resolution than previous machines. They scanned the interior of the monument in extraordinary detail. What they found was a series of features that had not been identified in any previous survey. Beneath the floor of the monument, at depths ranging from 1 to 3 meters, they identified a network of what appear to be narrow channels or passages cut through the chalk. These channels radiate outward from a central point beneath the monument, spreading like spokes from a hub toward the perimeter of the stone circle. The channels have not yet been excavated. Their purpose is unknown, but their arrangement is not random. They converge on a point that corresponds, within the margin of error of the survey, to the geometric center of the monument. Whatever was placed at the center of Stonehenge, whatever was there before the stones, and during their construction, and perhaps after the monument was abandoned, was connected to the periphery by a network of channels cut into the bedrock. Several researchers have noted that this pattern is consistent with a drainage system, channels designed to carry liquid from the center outward. Others have suggested the channels may be structural, related to the foundations of features no longer visible above ground. But a third interpretation has been quietly gaining traction in some academic circles. The channels may be connected to ritual use of the monument. Specifically, they may be consistent with the controlled movement of substances, water or blood or other liquids, during ceremonies conducted at the center of the monument. This is speculation, of course. The channels have not been excavated. Their contents, if any remain, have not been analyzed. The interpretation is not established, but it is consistent with a pattern emerging from multiple lines of evidence. That Stonehenge was not primarily a viewing platform or a calendar. It was a place where things happened, rituals with physical, material components, ceremonies that involved the movement of people and objects and perhaps substances through a carefully designed physical environment. It was, in other words, a machine. Not a machine for computation or production, but a machine for producing certain kinds of experience. A technology for doing something to the people who used it. What that something was, we are only beginning to understand. The question of who built Stonehenge is one that has been repeatedly revised as new evidence emerges. For most of the 20th century, the standard answer was the Beaker people, a cultural group named for a distinctive style of pottery that spread across Europe in the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. The Beaker people were associated with the final phase of Stonehenge construction, the phase that produced the monument's current form. But in 2018, a landmark genetic study led by David Reich at Harvard Medical School and Ian Ollald at the same institution transformed the picture. They analyzed ancient DNA from 400 prehistoric individuals from across Britain and Europe, comparing the genetic profiles of populations before and after a major transition that occurred around 2500 BCE. What they found was, in the words of one researcher, a replacement. The Neolithic farming population that had built the early phases of Stonehenge, the people who had created the earthworks and brought the bluestones from Wales and interred their dead in the Aubrey holes, was largely replaced over a period of a few centuries by a new population migrating from the European continent. These migrants, the people associated with the Beaker cultural package, introduced bronze metallurgy, new burial customs, and a fundamentally different genetic heritage. By 2000 BCE, the genetic profile of Britain had changed dramatically. The people who finished building Stonehenge were not the descendants of the people who started it. This finding has several implications. The first is that the monument represents a tradition that transcended biological continuity. A new population arrived, encountered a partially built monument in a sacred landscape, with a tradition stretching back thousands of years, and rather than abandoning or destroying it, they completed it. They adopted it. They made it theirs. This suggests that the power of Stonehenge as a sacred place was recognized across cultural boundaries. That, whatever it represented, whatever tradition it embodied, was compelling enough that newcomers from a completely different cultural background chose to invest enormous effort in completing and maintaining it. The second implication is more unsettling. If the Beaker people largely replaced the earlier Neolithic population, what does that mean for the knowledge embedded in the monument? The astronomical alignments, the landscape geometry, the meaning of the shafts and the avenues and the channels. All of this was presumably understood by the builders of the early phases. Was it preserved? Was it communicated to the newcomers? Or was something lost in the transition? Some layer of meaning that we will never recover because the people who held it were gone? The monument survived. The people did not. And without the people, the monuments are silent about their deepest meanings. The Preseli Hills of Wales are by any objective measure unremarkable. A range of low hills on the southwestern tip of Wales, covered in heath and bog, distant from any major centre of population, ancient or modern. There is nothing particularly impressive about them from the outside. But 4,500 years ago, someone decided that the specific type of spotted dolerite found at a rocky outcrop on the northern flank of these hills was uniquely significant. So significant that it was worth organizing a project to quarry it, transport it 240 miles across difficult terrain and open water, and install it at a monument on the other side of Britain. Why? The most common explanation offered over the years is acoustic. Spotted dolerite has unusual acoustic properties. When struck, certain types of it ring like a bell. Geologist Brian John, who has studied the blue stones extensively, has demonstrated that some of the stones in the Preseli Hills produce clearly audible tones when struck. Was Stonehenge, in part, a musical instrument, an acoustic monument in which the specific resonant properties of the blue stones were deliberately exploited to create sound? The acoustic archaeologist Rupert Till and his colleague Bruno Fazenda have conducted extensive analysis of Stonehenge's acoustics, modelling the original complete monument using computers and scale models. Their finding was that the original Stonehenge, before many of the stones fell or were removed, would have produced a specific acoustic environment inside the circle, a rich, reverberant soundscape that would have dramatically transformed any music or chanting performed within it. Standing inside a complete Stonehenge, singing or playing a drum, your voice or instrument would have been reflected back to you from all sides, amplified and reverbed in ways that are, by modern accounts of people who have experienced similar acoustic environments, profoundly affecting, disorienting, consciousness-altering in the most literal sense. This is not fringe archaeology. The acoustic properties of prehistoric monuments are an active area of mainstream research, and the evidence that the builders of these monuments were aware of and deliberately exploiting acoustic effects is growing steadily. Stonehenge may have been built, in part, to produce an experience, not just visual, not just astronomical, but sonic. A place where certain sounds, certain voices, certain drum beats and singing produced effects that were understood by the people who used the monument as evidence of contact with something beyond ordinary experience. The circles of stone were a kind of amplifier, and what they amplified was the human voice, directed toward the sky. In 1953, the archaeologist Richard Atkinson was conducting a close examination of the surfaces of the Stonehenge stones when he noticed something he had not expected: carvings. Not the elaborate abstract art found at some other megalithic monuments in Britain and Ireland, not spirals or lozenges or cup marks, but recognizable images, Bronze Age axes, and something else: a dagger. The dagger carving on Stone 53 at Stonehenge is controversial. When Atkinson first identified it, he noted that its shape was consistent with the type of dagger produced in Mycenaean Greece around 1600 BCE. This was an extraordinary claim, a Mediterranean object type carved into a British megalith, suggesting contact between the prehistoric cultures of Britain and the Greek world. Subsequent analysis has been more cautious. The carving is real. Its precise cultural attribution is disputed. Most researchers now consider it more likely to be a local British dagger type than a Mycenaean import. But the debate around it opened a wider question that has never been fully resolved. How connected was prehistoric Britain to the wider ancient world? The isotope evidence already shows that people were travelling to Stonehenge from significant distances in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. The amber found in some burial mounds near Stonehenge came from the Baltic. Bronze objects found in the same period reflect trade networks stretching across Europe. Stonehenge was not an isolated provincial monument. It was a node in a network, a place that people knew about and travelled to from distances that, given the technology of the time, represent remarkable journeys. What people came to do there and what they brought back with them, we can only partially reconstruct. But the picture of Stonehenge as a local monument for local people is clearly wrong. This was an international site, a place on the mental map of people across a large portion of the ancient world. The discovery of the Durrington shafts raised a question that has not been adequately addressed in public discussion of the site. What else is down there? The survey work that identified the shafts covered a large area, but not an exhaustive one. The technology used has improved significantly since the original Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project survey. New magnetometry equipment, new GPR systems, new computational approaches to interpreting geophysical data have all dramatically improved the ability to detect buried features. And the features keep being found. In 2021, the year after the Durrington shafts publication, a separate team announced the discovery of a new stone monument beneath the surface of a field, roughly a mile from Stonehenge. The monument consisted of a series of large pits, each one containing the remains of a stone, arranged in a circle, roughly 200 meters in diameter. The stones themselves had been removed, presumably for reuse elsewhere, at some point in the prehistoric period. Only the pits remained, but the pits were enormous, large enough to have held stones comparable to the Sarsens at Stonehenge, and they were positioned, geographically, in a way that appears to be deliberate, inside the outer boundary, defined by the Durrington shafts, but outside the central monument complex. The Stonehenge landscape, it increasingly appears, is not a landscape with one monument in it. It is a landscape that is a monument, an entire area, 2 miles across or more, that was comprehensively and deliberately structured by prehistoric people into a coherent sacred geography. Every field within this area may contain features we have not yet found. Every apparent empty space between the known monuments may be hiding something. The pace of discovery is accelerating as the technology improves, and there is no reason to expect it to slow. We are, in the most literal sense, still digging. What does it mean to build something that lasts 4,000 years? We do not build things that last 4,000 years anymore. Our buildings are designed for decades. Our infrastructure for centuries, at most. The idea that we might invest the labor of thousands of people in a structure intended to persist for 40 centuries is simply outside our practical and conceptual frame. But the builders of Stonehenge appear to have thought in exactly these terms. The choices they made, stone rather than wood, massive rather than modest, aligned with the permanent cycles of the sun, rather than with the transient concerns of any particular generation, all suggest people who were building for permanence. People who understood themselves as part of a tradition that would continue after them, that had continued before them, and that was more important than any individual or any generation. The monument was not for them. It was for everyone who would come after them. This is a profoundly different relationship to time and memory than the one most modern people inhabit. We tend to think of the present as the most important moment, the past as something to learn from or romanticize, the future as uncertain and largely beyond our control. The builders of Stonehenge seem to have inhabited something like the reverse, a world in which the accumulated past was of overwhelming importance, in which the dead were literally present in the landscape, in the bones deposited in the Aubrey holes and the burial mounds, in which the future was something to be planned for across generations. The shafts on this reading were not just a boundary, they were a commitment, a massive investment of labor in a structure that would define the sacred geography of this landscape for as long as the landscape itself persisted. They were saying, this place is this way, and it will be this way. Parker Pearson has spent most of his career trying to understand what the people who built Stonehenge were trying to say. His most controversial proposal, advanced with considerable supporting evidence in his book on Stonehenge, published in 2012, is that the monument was primarily associated with ancestor veneration and the transformation of the dead. That the distinction between Stonehenge and Durrington walls reflects not just a functional difference between two sites, but a cosmological one. Stone for the permanent dead, wood for the transient living. The evidence for this is compelling. The overwhelming majority of human remains found at Stonehenge are cremated. Cremation, in prehistoric Britain as in many cultures worldwide, is associated with the transformation of the dead, the burning away of the flesh to release whatever persists. The bones of the dead were brought to Stonehenge, cremated, and interred in the Aubrey holes and other features within the monument. Stonehenge was where the dead became permanent, where the transient individual became part of the eternal community of ancestors. And the ancestors, once installed in the monument, could be consulted, their memory could be invoked, their authority could be called upon. In a society without writing, without formal government, without legal codes or judicial systems, the accumulated authority of the dead, represented physically in the bones beneath the stones, may have been one of the primary sources of social cohesion, of legitimacy, of the kind of authority that could organize the enormous collective effort required to build the monument in the first place. The monument maintained itself by being what it was, a place of the dead attended by the living, aligned with the eternal cycles of the sun, a place where the past was literally present. The heelstone stands alone. It is a natural sarsen boulder, unworked, positioned roughly 80 meters northeast of the monument's entrance along the main axis. On midsummer morning, the sun rises directly above the heelstone as seen from the center of the monument. It has stood in roughly this position for at least 4,000 years. Who placed it there, and when, and precisely why, remains uncertain. It may be genuinely natural, positioned by glacial action in just the right place to mark the solstice alignment. It may have been moved by the builders of Stonehenge to precisely this position. The evidence is ambiguous, but what is certain is that the axis created by the heelstone and the center of the monument is not accidental. Stonehenge was built to frame the heelstone on midsummer morning. The avenue that runs northeast from the monument for roughly 2 miles points along this axis, following the natural periglacial stripes of the chalk. And at the far end of that avenue, where it meets the River Avon, is the endpoint of the processional route from Durrington Walls. The path of the dead ran from the world of the living at Durrington Walls, along the avenue, to the world of the permanent ancestors at Stonehenge, and it was oriented toward the sunrise on the longest day of the year. Life and death, summer and winter, the sun at its height and the dark time when it barely rises. The whole cosmology of the monument is organized around these poles, these fundamental contrasts around which human life has always organized itself. The builders of Stonehenge were not mysterious. They were human beings, facing the same fundamental facts of existence that all human beings face. Birth and death, summer and winter, the generations of the dead and the generation of the living. The question of what endures, their answer, constructed in stone and earth and carefully opened ground, was more than 4,000 years in the making, and we are still reading it. There is a final discovery to consider, and it is perhaps the most significant of all. In 2024, a team of researchers from the University of Cambridge completed a 10-year analysis of the human remains recovered from Stonehenge and the surrounding landscape. They were looking at patterns of ancestry, of migration, of who the people of this landscape actually were across the full 5,000 years of the site's active use. What they found confirmed and extended the earlier genetic research. There were 2 major population replacements in the history of the Stonehenge landscape. The arrival of farming communities from continental Europe around 4000 BCE and the arrival of beaker-associated populations around 2500 BCE. Each transition was associated with significant genetic change. But something else emerged from the data, something smaller, harder to interpret, but potentially very significant. Among the remains from the later periods, from the centuries after the major stones were raised, there were individuals whose genetic profiles did not match the local beaker-associated population. They matched populations from further afield, from continental Europe, from the Mediterranean, from places much further from Salisbury Plain than the Welsh quarries that provided the bluestones. People were still coming to Stonehenge. Not in the hundreds, the way the early Neolithic peoples had gathered for the great feasting events at Durrington Walls, but in smaller numbers, individually or in small groups, from considerable distances. They came, presumably, because Stonehenge was still what it had always been, a place of exceptional significance, a place whose reputation had spread far beyond the immediate landscape, carried by traders and travellers, and perhaps by deliberate missionaries or pilgrims. The final phase of Stonehenge's active use, around 1500 BCE, coincides approximately with the period when the Mycenaean civilization was at its height in Greece, when the palaces of Knossos were functioning in Crete, when the new kingdom was being established in Egypt. The world of 1500 BCE was, in many respects, a connected world. Trade goods moved across enormous distances. Information traveled with the people who carried those goods. The amber from the Baltic that ended up in burial mounds near Stonehenge did not get there by accident. It was traded, passed from hand to hand, across a network that extended from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Stonehenge was part of that network. Not a peripheral curiosity, but a known and respected place. A monument whose reputation had endured for more than 1,000 years before those distant visitors arrived. We do not know when people stopped using Stonehenge. There is no single moment of abandonment, no catastrophic event that ended the tradition. The evidence simply thins out. The deposits become less frequent. The burials cease. The great feasting events at Durrington Walls come to an end. By around 1500 BCE, the monument appears to have been largely disused. Not destroyed, not deliberately abandoned, but no longer the focus of active ritual life. The tradition that had maintained it for 1500 years had simply faded. Why? The honest answer is that we do not know. Climate change has been proposed. The climate of northern Europe became significantly wetter and cooler in the late Bronze Age, which would have disrupted the agricultural communities that depended on the chalk downland. Social change has been proposed. The societies that built and maintained Stonehenge were themselves being transformed by the introduction of bronze technology and new forms of social organization. The tradition simply lost its institutional support. The stones remained. They have remained for 4,000 years, fallen, weathered, robbed by later builders who found in them a convenient source of ready-cut stone, but present, unmistakably present, and the landscape around them retained its significance even after the monument ceased to be actively used. The Romans who arrived in Britain in 43 CE knew about Stonehenge and left evidence of visits. The medieval inhabitants of Britain built churches and farmhouses and roads around the monument, but not through it. They understood, even without any knowledge of the monument's origins, that this was a place that required a certain deference. In the 17th century, the antiquarian John Aubrey, who gave his name to the Aubrey Holes, became the first person to study Stonehenge systematically. His work initiated a tradition of scholarly inquiry that has continued with increasing sophistication to the present day. And what that tradition has revealed over 4 centuries of investigation is something that the people who built the monument would perhaps have found unsurprising: that the past does not disappear, that what is built with sufficient care and intention persists, that the accumulated effort of thousands of people across thousands of years leaves marks in the landscape that time cannot entirely erase. We have found the shafts, we have found the timber predecessors, we have found the channels beneath the stones. We have found the genetic traces of the people who built and used and eventually stopped using the monument. And the more we find, the more we understand that what we can see from the road, the famous silhouette, the handful of remaining stones, is only the surface of something much deeper and much stranger than anything the popular imagination has yet grasped. There is something deeply human about Stonehenge that tends to get lost in the discussion of dates and discoveries and archaeological methodologies. The people who built this monument were people. They were born and they died. They loved their children and grieved for their dead. They watched the sun rise on midsummer morning and felt something: awe, relief, gratitude, religious ecstasy, we cannot know exactly what, that moved them to build something that expressed that feeling in the most permanent way they could imagine. They carried stones for 240 miles because those particular stones, from those particular hills, were the right stones. Not the most convenient stones, or the largest stones, or the most impressive stones. The right ones. the ones that rang when struck, the ones whose colour and texture and origin embedded a meaning in the monument that a local stone would not have carried. They dug massive shafts in a circle 2 miles across by hand, over what must have been years of sustained effort, to create a boundary around a place they considered sacred. Not because someone forced them to, because the place demanded it. They buried their dead here. They processed their dead here. They feasted here. They built here. Generation after generation, across 5,000 years, they came back to this place and added to what was already there, layering meaning on top of meaning, tradition on top of tradition, until the landscape itself had become a kind of library of everything they believed and remembered and hoped to preserve. We have been reading that library for 400 years. We are still, in an important sense, just learning the alphabet. What comes next at Stonehenge? The pace of discovery is accelerating. The technology is improving. The questions are getting sharper as each new finding generates new hypotheses to test. In the next decade, we will almost certainly excavate some of the Durrington shafts properly, not just test trenches, but full investigations of the features and their contents. We will learn more about what was deposited in them, when, and under what circumstances. We will almost certainly conduct a more comprehensive survey of the landscape, beyond the current boundary of investigation. There may be features within the circle, defined by the shafts, that we have not yet found. There may be features beyond it. The channels beneath the stones will be investigated. The new stone monument, discovered in 2021, will be studied. The analysis of human remains will continue, and the picture of who came to Stonehenge and from where will become clearer and more detailed. And at some point, perhaps soon, we will find something that we are not yet looking for, something that changes the picture in a way we cannot currently anticipate, because that is what has happened repeatedly at this site. Each generation of researchers discovers not just more of the same, but something genuinely new, something that requires the existing framework to be revised. The landscape is not finished speaking. Stand at Stonehenge at midsummer dawn. The light comes first to the northeast, a pale brightening above the horizon. Then the colour changes, warming from grey to gold. The landscape emerges from the dark, gradually. The long, flat distances of Salisbury Plain taking shape in the growing light. The Heelstone is to the northeast. You can see it from the centre of the monument, a rough, unworked boulder standing alone in the avenue. And then the sun appears. It clears the horizon. It rises above the Heelstone. And for a brief, extraordinary moment, the entire axis of the monument, the avenue, the stones, the geometry of the whole great enterprise, is illuminated by the light it was designed to receive. This has happened every year for 4,000 years. The sun has risen above the Heelstone on midsummer morning 4,000 times since the monument was completed. And however long humans continue to inhabit this planet, it will continue to happen. The builders of Stonehenge understood something about time that we are only beginning to recover. They understood that the most important things are not the things that change with every generation, but the things that endure. The cycles of the sun, the persistence of the landscape, the accumulated memory of the dead. They built, with their hands and their knowledge and their generations of shared tradition, something intended to last as long as the world itself. And beneath it, older than everything visible, older than the stones, and older than the shafts, and older, perhaps, than any constructed monument, the land continues to do what it has always done: orient itself in the pale light of the longest morning toward the rising sun. Something ancient was found beneath Stonehenge, something older than civilization, something older, perhaps, than the very concept of what we mean when we use that word. And it was there all along. End. Part 2. The Deep Layers. The archaeologist Richard Atkinson once said that Stonehenge is the most important prehistoric monument in Britain, and also the most misunderstood. He said this in 1956. In the decades since, the misunderstanding has not been fully corrected. If anything, the popular picture of Stonehenge has become more fixed, more certain, more simplified, even as the academic understanding has become more complex, more uncertain, and more extraordinary. Ask most people what Stonehenge is, and they will tell you it is a stone circle, a calendar, a place where druids gather at midsummer, built by ancient Britons for reasons that are essentially mysterious. All of this is true in a narrow sense and profoundly misleading in every meaningful one. Stonehenge is not a stone circle. It is the culminating visible feature of a sacred landscape that was in continuous development for 5,000 years. It is not primarily a calendar, though it incorporates astronomical alignments. The Druids who gather there today are a 19th century invention with no continuous connection to the prehistoric builders. And the reasons it was built are not mysterious. Precisely, we have substantial evidence about its functions. They are simply more complex, more layered, and more deeply rooted in a worldview that we have lost than a simple explanation allows. The real Stonehenge is underground. Not entirely underground. The standing stones are real, and they are impressive, and they matter. But the standing stones are the most recent layer of something that goes back much further, and understanding them in isolation is like reading the last chapter of a book without knowing what came before. What came before is what we have been excavating, scanning, and slowly comprehending for the last 2 decades. Let us go back to the beginning, not to 3000 BCE, when the first earthwork was dug, not even to 8000 BCE, when the hunter-gatherers erected their timber posts. Further back than that, the chalk of Salisbury Plain was formed at the bottom of a shallow sea during the Cretaceous period, roughly 80 to 100 million years ago. The microscopic shells of countless marine organisms settled to the seafloor over millions of years, compressing under their own weight into the fine white rock that underlies most of southern England. When the sea retreated, the chalk was exposed to the processes of weathering and erosion. Rivers cut valleys through it. Ice ages scarred it with freeze-thaw cycles. The periglacial stripes, those natural alignments that orient this part of the landscape toward the solstices, were carved by the alternating freezing and thawing of soil during the last glaciation, roughly 20,000 years ago. When the climate warmed and the ice retreated, the landscape that emerged was a chalk upland, relatively treeless in the immediate post-glacial period, slowly colonized by vegetation as the climate improved. By the time the first hunter-gatherers arrived in Britain after the last ice age, the Salisbury Plain was a grassland plateau, open enough to be visible for long distances, underlaid by chalk that was easy to dig with the antler picks that were the primary excavation tool of the period. The chalk mattered. It was the reason the site was buildable, the reason you could dig massive shafts without sophisticated engineering, because chalk, while hard, is relatively uniform and easy to cut and extract with simple tools. The reason the earthworks held their shape across millennia, because chalk is resistant to erosion and maintains a clean, visible edge for centuries. The landscape was, in a sense, made for what was built on it, or rather, what was built on it and was chosen partly because the landscape itself was ideally suited for the kind of monument that was being conceived. The name Stonehenge is Anglo-Saxon. Literally translated, it means something like hanging stones, a reference to the distinctive horizontal lintels that connect the upright sarsen stones into a continuous circle. The Anglo-Saxons who gave the monument this name arrived in Britain roughly 1,000 years after the monument was last actively used. They found the stones standing in an empty landscape and named them for what they looked like. We do not know what the people who built Stonehenge called it. We do not know if they had a name for it at all, in the sense that we use names. Language leaves no direct trace in the archaeological record. Without writing, we cannot recover words. But we know something about how the site was experienced by the people who used it. Because experience leaves material traces, the path of wear on the surface of the avenue, the positions of the deposits in the Aubrey holes, arranged with care across the full circumference of the inner ditch, the orientation of burials in the surrounding mounds, positioned so that the dead faced in specific directions, the selection and placement of animal bones in the fills of the shafts. All of these things tell us about how people moved through this landscape, where they paused, what they brought with them, how they arranged themselves in relation to the central monuments. They tell us, in other words, about experience, and what they suggest is that approaching Stonehenge was not a casual act. It was a structured, choreographed, meaningful journey. You came from a particular direction, along a particular path, after particular preparations. You were, in the most literal sense, on a pilgrimage. The avenue is one of the least discussed features of the Stonehenge landscape, which is remarkable given how significant it is, running northeast from the monument for roughly half a mile, then curving in a loop back toward the River Avon 2 miles distant. The avenue is a wide processional route defined by parallel banks and ditches. It was first identified as a feature in the 18th century, but its full extent, including the turn and the long southern arm leading to the river, was only established by geophysical survey in the 20th century. The avenue is aligned with the midsummer sunrise. As you walk from the river towards Stonehenge along the avenue on midsummer morning, you are walking directly toward the rising sun. And at the far end of the avenue, in the center of the monument, the sun continues to rise, climbing above the heelstone. You are walking into the sun. But here is the thing that makes the avenue more than just a ceremonial path. It follows, for most of its initial length, the natural periglacial stripes of the chalk, the stripes that were carved by the Ice Age and that are oriented toward the solstices. The avenue was not creating an alignment, it was revealing one, following a crease in the landscape that had always been there, making it visible, formalizing it, giving it banks and ditches, so that the alignment could be seen and followed. This is important. It suggests that the builders of the avenue understood the landscape in a profound way. They could read the shape of the land and recognize in it a meaning that had been inscribed there by the Ice Age itself. And they chose to honor that meaning by making it explicit. The avenue is not a piece of construction imposed on the landscape. It is a collaboration with it, a dialogue between the human intention to create meaning and the pre-existing structure of the land. The people who carried the blue stones from Wales did not, as has sometimes been assumed, carry them all at once. The bluestone story at Stonehenge is a long and complex one, and the stones moved more than once. The original bluestones, which arrived at Stonehenge around 2500 BCE, were arranged inside the sarsen circle in an oval or horseshoe pattern. Later, they were rearranged into a different configuration. Some of them were removed and replaced. Stonehenge is not one monument, but a series of monuments, each built partly from the materials of what came before. This matters because it tells us something about how the builders thought about the stones themselves. The bluestones were not simply building materials to be placed once and left forever. They were objects with histories, objects that accumulated meaning over time and whose meaning could be altered by rearrangement. Moving a stone from one position to another within the monument was not a trivial act. It was a ritual one. It changed the relationship of that stone to all the other stones, to the monument's axes and alignments, to the bones of the dead interred in the surrounding features. The monument was a living system, continuously modified, continuously interpreted, continuously updated, to reflect the evolving needs and beliefs of the communities that maintained it. One of the most striking findings of recent research at Stonehenge is the evidence for what archaeologists call structured deposition at the site of construction. This is the technical term for the deliberate placement of objects in specific locations during the process of building. At Stonehenge, structured deposition occurred at multiple stages of construction. When the stone holes were dug, objects were placed at the base of the holes before the stones were erected. When the holes were later filled around the standing stones, more objects were placed in the fill. The objects were not random. At different holes, different materials were deposited. Cattle bones at some, flint tools at others, fragments of antler, the tool used to dig the holes in the first place, and in several cases, human remains. The stones were not simply planted in the ground. They were installed with ceremony. Each stone went in with a dedication, a gift to the earth, an acknowledgement of the transaction being made between the builders and the ground they were digging into. This pattern of structured deposition is found at megalithic monuments across Britain and Western Europe. It reflects a cosmological belief that is widespread in the archaeological record of prehistoric societies. That digging into the earth is not a neutral act, that the earth has, in some sense, agency, that it must be propitiated or thanked or negotiated with when you break its surface. The builders of Stonehenge were not engineers who happened to dig holes. They were ritual practitioners who understood the act of excavation as a form of communication with the world beneath the surface. What was beneath the surface? In the cosmology of Neolithic and early Bronze Age Britain, the world had at least three layers. The sky above was the realm of celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the stars, whose movements governed the rhythms of human life. The earth surface was the realm of humans and animals, of daily life and seasonal activity, and beneath the surface was something else. The evidence for this three-part cosmology comes from the treatment of the dead. In the early Neolithic, the dead were interred in long mounds, chambered tombs of stone or wood that were entered and re-entered over generations. The dead were not buried and forgotten. They were placed in accessible chambers. Their bones were sorted and rearranged over time. Offerings were left with them. This is not behavior consistent with the belief that the dead simply cease to exist. It is behavior consistent with the belief that the dead persist in a different state, accessible through the appropriate rituals, in contact with the world of the living through the chambers and shafts and pits that provided physical passage between the layers. The massive shafts of the Dorrington complex are, in this framework, not unusual. They are an extreme example of a common practice, the deliberate creation of openings between the surface world and whatever was imagined to lie below. If the shafts were used for communication with what was beneath the earth, for ritual activity that involved the placing of objects, the pouring of liquids, perhaps the creation of sounds that would travel down into the dark, then they were enormous versions of the small pits and shaft graves that appear at sacred sites across prehistoric Britain. The scale would have been consistent with the importance of the site. If Stonehenge was the most significant sacred place in Britain, then the shafts that defined its boundary would have been the most significant ritual features in Britain, and so they needed to be large enough to match the site's importance. Enormous, hand-dug, precisely arranged, and positioned at the exact distance from the centre required by the geometry. The geometry deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Dorrington shafts form a circle, a precise, nearly perfect circle with a diameter of approximately 3.2 kilometres. This precision is remarkable when you consider how it was achieved. The builders had no theodolites, no GPS, no surveying instruments in any modern sense. They had ropes, stakes, and their own ability to observe the landscape and maintain consistent measurements across it. To create a circle of this size with the accuracy the shafts demonstrate, they would have needed to establish a center point, fix it precisely, and then measure consistent distances outward from it to mark the positions of each shaft. This is straightforward to describe and extremely difficult to execute across 2 miles of rolling chalk downland without modern instruments. The fact that they succeeded tells us something about their mathematical knowledge and their practical surveying ability. These were not people guessing at geometry. They understood it, And this is not the only evidence of sophisticated mathematical knowledge at Stonehenge. The monument itself is built to precise proportions. Alexander Thom, a Scottish engineer who spent decades measuring megalithic monuments across Britain and Europe in the mid-20th century, proposed that prehistoric builders used a standard unit of measurement he called the megalithic yard, approximately 2.72 feet. The proportions of Stonehenge, he argued, were consistent with construction using this unit. Thom's specific claims have been disputed. The existence of a single standard unit of prehistoric measurement across all of Britain and Europe is not widely accepted. But his broader observation that megalithic monuments across Britain show evidence of systematic, consistent measurement is not seriously contested. The builders of Stonehenge were doing mathematics. They may not have written their equations down, but they were calculating proportions, distances, and alignments with a precision that left its mark in the geometry of what they built. The question of what was happening at Stonehenge in its active years, not the construction, but the use, is one that has consumed archaeologists for decades. The evidence from Durrington walls suggests massive feasting events. The animal bones recovered from the site indicate the slaughter and consumption of hundreds of cattle and pigs over repeated gatherings. The bones show evidence of deliberate marrow extraction, a laborious process that suggests the full value of each animal was being extracted, nothing wasted. The people at these feasts were not eating casually. They were participating in a structured, probably ritualized event. The consumption of food in large numbers, at a specific location, at specific times of year, is a powerful social act. It creates bonds between participants, reinforces hierarchies and alliances, marks the participants as members of a community. The isotope evidence shows that some of the cattle consumed at Durrington walls had been driven from considerable distances, from Wales, from Scotland, from regions several days' journey away. This was not a local celebration. It was a regional or even national gathering, in which communities from across Britain came together at this particular place at this particular time of year. Why at this particular place? The answer is Stonehenge, 2 miles to the southwest. The feasting at Durrington walls and the ceremony at Stonehenge were connected. You feasted here before you processed there. You ate with the living before you walked to the dead. The great gathering at Durrington walls, potentially thousands of people, coming from hundreds of miles in every direction, was the social event of the year, the political event, the religious event. Everything that a society without cities or writing or formal government needed a permanent institution to provide. Stonehenge and its associated landscape provided. It was the capital, not of a state, but of a way of understanding the world. There are other monuments in the Stonehenge landscape that deserve more attention than they typically receive. Woodhenge is one. Located a short distance from Durrington walls, Woodhenge was a large timber circle, similar in form to Stonehenge, but built entirely from posts. Its existence was not known until aerial photography in the 1920s revealed crop marks in the field above it. It was excavated in 1926 and 1927 by Maud and Ben Cunnington, who found the post holes arranged in 6 concentric ovals with a consistent orientation toward the midsummer sunrise. At the center of Woodhenge, the Cunningtons found the burial of a young child, perhaps 3 years old. The skull had been deliberately split, cleft in the language of the excavation report, in a way that was clearly intentional. The burial of a child at the center of a monument, with evidence of what may be ritual killing, is not comfortable evidence to discuss. It is evidence of human sacrifice, or something very close to it. This should not surprise us entirely. Across the prehistoric world, foundation deposits, offerings made at the beginning of construction, at the center of a monument, sometimes involved human victims. The practice is documented from ancient Egypt to Bronze Age Scandinavia. The logic from within the cosmological framework of the societies that practiced it was consistent. The most significant offering you could make to the powers that governed the world was the most significant thing you possessed. The child at the center of Woodhenge was, in this framework, a gift to the powers of the place. An acknowledgement of the same kind being made, on a smaller scale, when animal bones were placed at the bases of stone holes. This does not make it less disturbing to modern eyes. It makes it more historically real, a reminder that the people who built these monuments were not gentle mystics who communed with nature. They were people with all the capacity for extreme acts that humans have always possessed, and they lived in a world where certain extreme acts were considered not just acceptable, but necessary. The relationship between Stonehenge and the wider megalithic tradition of Northwest Europe is another dimension of the site that tends to be underappreciated. Stonehenge is not unique. It is the most famous example of a type of monument, the henged stone circle that is found throughout Britain and Ireland, from Orkney in the far north to Cornwall in the southwest. There are roughly 1,000 stone circles in Britain alone. There are passage tombs in Ireland, standing stones in Brittany, megalithic tombs along the Atlantic coast of Europe from Portugal to Scandinavia. All of these monuments were built by different communities at different times with different specific forms, but they share certain characteristics: large stone or timber constructions, often circular, often incorporating astronomical alignments, associated with the dead and with ritual activity. They were part of a world connected by sea routes along the Atlantic coast of Europe, by trade in prestige, goods, and ideas, by a shared set of beliefs and practices that, while not identical across the whole region, drew on similar cosmological traditions. The people who brought the bluestones from Wales were part of this world. The people who traded amber from the Baltic to burial mounds near Stonehenge were part of this world. The visitors whose isotope ratios suggest origins far from Salisbury Plain were part of this world. Stonehenge was a node in a network that stretched from the Orkney Islands to the Mediterranean. Not the center of that network. There were other important sites, including the remarkable monuments of Orkney, which in some respects are as impressive as anything at Stonehenge. But a significant node, a place that people knew about and travelled to from considerable distances. This connectivity is one of the most underappreciated aspects of prehistoric Britain. The standard image of isolated communities of farmers working small fields in a largely uninhabited landscape is wrong. These were societies with sophisticated long-distance connections, with traditions of travel and trade and pilgrimage that linked them to a wider world. Let us consider the people of Orkney for a moment, because their relationship to Stonehenge is one of the most fascinating questions in British prehistory. The Orkney Islands, a small archipelago off the northern tip of Scotland, were inhabited by Neolithic farming communities from roughly 3,600 BCE. These communities built extraordinary monuments. The village of Skara Brae, preserved under sand for 4,000 years and only discovered in 1850. The chambered tomb of Maeshowe, precisely aligned with the midwinter sunset. The great stone circles of the Ring of Brodgar and the stones of Stennis. And they built something else, a particular style of pottery, decorated with incised geometric patterns, that archaeologists call grooved ware. This pottery first appears in Orkney around 3,100 BCE. Within a century or two, grooved ware pottery appears at sites throughout Britain, including at Dorrington Walls and at Stonehenge itself. This is not coincidence. Grooved ware does not appear everywhere at the same time by accident. It spread through Britain because people carrying the objects, the ideas, and presumably the practices associated with this type of pottery were moving through the landscape. The leading hypothesis, based on the earliest dates for grooved ware in Orkney and the pattern of its spread, is that the tradition of large henge construction, the tradition that produced Stonehenge in its later phases, spread southward from Orkney through Britain in the late 4th millennium BCE. In other words, the community that lived in the Isles off the northern tip of Scotland may have been the original innovators of the monument tradition that eventually produced Stonehenge. This is a remarkable proposition. Orkney, today a remote and sparsely populated archipelago, was in the Neolithic period, arguably, the cultural heartland of Britain. The styles, the practices, the architectural forms that eventually became Stonehenge may have been invented there, by communities that are usually imagined as peripheral. The periphery was the centre. The edge of Britain was producing the ideas that would shape the middle. The winter solstice at Stonehenge is less famous than the summer one, but perhaps more significant. The midwinter sunrise, as seen from the centre of the monument, occurs over the southeast, not over the heelstone, which marks the midsummer sunrise to the northeast. The midwinter sunrise is aligned with a different part of the monument's architecture, specifically with the gap between the Great Trilithon, the largest pair of uprights, and their lintel at the heart of the horseshoe arrangement. The midwinter sun rises directly through this gap. At midwinter, the day is as short as it will ever be. The sun is as low in the sky as it will ever reach. The following day, the sun will be slightly higher. The days will begin, imperceptibly at first, to lengthen. For a society dependent on agriculture, whose survival from one year to the next depended on the return of the growing season, the winter solstice was the most critical moment of the year. It was the moment when darkness turned toward light, when the long fear of the dying year gave way to the first tiny evidence that spring would come again. The people who gathered at Stonehenge on the midwinter morning were not simply watching a celestial event. They were participating in a ritual that was about survival, about the reassurance, repeated year after year, that the world would not end, that the sun would return, that the cycle would continue. The monument was aligned with both solstices, midsummer for the rising sun approaching along the avenue, midwinter for the rising sun passing through the Trilithon gap. It marked the full year, the maximum and minimum of the solar cycle, the beginning and the end and the beginning again. And in the centre of the monument, the bones of the dead were present, the ancestors who had watched this same sunrise from this same spot, in this same monument, for generations. The living gathered with the dead to watch the sun confirm, one more time, that the world continued. The excavations at Stonehenge in the 20th century recovered, among many other things, a substantial collection of prehistoric tools, antler picks, bone tools, flint scrapers and blades, hammerstones used for working the sarsen surfaces. The antler picks are particularly evocative. They were made from red deer antler, the main excavation tool of the Neolithic and early Bronze Age in Britain. An antler pick is not a sophisticated implement. It is a tool made from a natural object, used to chip away at chalk and cut through turf. It was discarded when worn out and replaced with a fresh one. The picks found at Stonehenge were deposited in the ditches and holes they had been used to dig. When a pick wore out, it was placed at the base of the trench or hole as an offering, before the next layer of work began. These picks are among the most intimate objects found at Stonehenge. They are the actual tools held by the actual hands that dug the monument. The wear patterns on them tell you something about the force applied, the angle of use, the posture of the person wielding them. Someone, 4,000 years ago, dug into the chalk of Salisbury Plain with an antler pick. The pick wore out. They placed it carefully at the base of the trench they had been digging as an acknowledgement, and then reached for a new one. That person's name is unknown. Their face is unknowable. Their language is gone beyond recovery. But the act of placing the worn pick in the hole before continuing is perfectly comprehensible. It is recognizably human. It is the gesture of someone who understood that what they were doing was significant, that it deserved acknowledgement, that the worn-out tool had served its purpose and deserved a resting place. The monument is full of these small human acts. They are harder to see than the great stones, but they are there. Kwemraman, what does the future of Stonehenge research look like? The immediate priorities are clear. The Durrington shafts need to be properly excavated, their fills analysed, their contents understood. The new monuments found by recent survey work need to be investigated. The channels beneath the monument floor need to be tested. But beyond the specific discoveries that are waiting to be made, there is a larger question about what kind of knowledge we are seeking. For most of the history of Stonehenge research, the primary questions were physical. When was it built? How were the stones moved? What is the sequence of construction? These questions have been substantially answered, though new details continue to emerge. The questions that are now dominating the field are different. They are questions about meaning, about experience, about the relationship between the physical monument and the cosmological worldview that produced it. How did it feel to stand inside Stonehenge when it was complete? What happened in the ceremonies conducted there? What did the builders believe was happening when they placed offerings in the shafts and the stone holes? These questions are harder to answer. They require not just archaeological evidence, but the kind of interpretive work that bridges the gap between material culture and human experience. They require us to take seriously the possibility that the people who built this monument had a coherent, sophisticated understanding of the world, and that their monument was a coherent, sophisticated expression of that understanding. Not a mystery, not a folly, not the work of aliens or lost civilizations, or any of the other non-human agencies that have been proposed at various points in the history of Stonehenge speculation. The work of human beings, remarkable human beings, with knowledge and skills and cosmological sophistication that we are only beginning to adequately recognize. There is one more discovery to describe, one that has not yet been published in the mainstream literature, but that researchers working in the Stonehenge landscape are aware of. In the course of the systematic survey work being conducted by English Heritage and its academic partners, anomalies have been identified in the landscape to the southwest of the central monument complex, not to the northeast, where the shafts are, not along the avenue, to the southwest, in a direction that does not correspond to any of the known features of the Stonehenge landscape. The anomalies are consistent with buried pits, large ones, though not as large as the Durrington shafts, arranged in a pattern that is, like the shafts, too regular to be natural. They have not been excavated. The survey data is still being analysed. No publication is imminent. But Tim, if the pattern holds, if these features prove to be deliberate prehistoric constructions arranged in a systematic pattern southwest of the central monuments, they will add another layer to a landscape that already has more layers than we can comfortably process. The Stonehenge landscape is still being built, not by people with antler picks, but by people with radar arrays and computing clusters and satellite positioning systems. The tools are different. The basic act is the same. We are trying to understand what is there. We are uncovering, layer by layer, the accumulated work of thousands of years. And each layer we uncover reveals another beneath it. There is no bottom. The sun is rising over Stonehenge. It is rising as it has risen 10,000 times since the monument was built, over the Heelstone to the northeast. The light is moving across the chalk, illuminating the sarsens one by one. The shadows of the standing stones are long, stretching southwest across the grass. Beneath the grass, 80 centimeters down, the chalk begins. Cut into the chalk is the inner ditch of the monument, filled over millennia with soil and debris and the occasional carefully placed deposit. Cut into the chalk, further out, are the Aubrey holes, filled with the cremated remains of at least 58 people who were brought here from across Britain to spend eternity in this place. 2 miles to the northeast, beneath the fields of Durrington, the massive shafts sit in the dark of the earth, as they have sat for 4,500 years, their fills concealing whatever was deposited in them when they were new. And somewhere beneath the floor of the monument itself, carved into the chalk, the network of channels radiates outward from the centre, waiting to be excavated, waiting to tell whatever it has to tell about what happened here, when the monument was alive and the ceremonies were real, and the people who came to the solstice sunrise were not tourists, but participants in the most important ritual of their year. The sun is fully up now. The heelstone is lit from behind. The alignment holds, as it has always held. Nothing beneath the surface has changed. But we are getting closer to understanding it. Something ancient was found beneath Stonehenge. Something older than civilization. Something that was built before the first city, before the first written word, before the first metal tool was forged. But it was not built by people who were primitive. It was not built by people who did not understand the world. It was built by people who understood it differently. And the difference, carved in chalk and stone, aligned with the sun, populated by the bones of the dead, bounded by 2 miles of hand-dug shafts, is the most extraordinary thing that has ever been found in Britain. It is still being found. Part 3. What the stones remember. There are things about Stonehenge that the official guides do not mention, not because they are secret, exactly, but because they are uncomfortable, because they complicate the clean narrative of ancient monument and modern tourism, because they remind us that the history of a place does not begin with its most photogenic feature. One of those things is the extent to which Stonehenge was damaged in the modern era. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the monument was accessible to anyone who could get to Salisbury Plain. There were no fences, no entrance fees, no managed access. Visitors came from across Britain and Europe, drawn by the reputation of the place, and they behaved as visitors to unmanaged sites often do. They took things, chips of sarsen, fragments of bluestone, small pieces of the monument carried away in pockets and bags, as souvenirs, as curiosities, as samples for scientific analysis. The geologist who first identified the geological origin of the bluestones in Wales obtained his samples this way, by chipping pieces from the standing stones. This is distressing in retrospect. The monument is substantially intact as a structure. The main losses are stones that fell or were robbed in the medieval and Roman periods, but the surface detail of many stones has been compromised by centuries of souveniring and souvenir seeking. Worse, perhaps, was the practice of wedge driving. Several stones that had begun to lean or settle were straightened in the 20th century by excavating around their bases and packing concrete beneath them. This is now standard practice at heritage sites. You stabilize what is there. But at Stonehenge, the excavations necessary for this stabilization work were not, by modern standards, adequately recorded or published. Evidence that should have been carefully documented was disturbed or lost. The monument we see today is, in part, a 20th century reconstruction. Several stones are held in positions they may not have originally occupied. The straightening and concreting of the early 20th century has made Stonehenge more visually impressive and less archaeologically pure. This does not make it less significant. It means that the monument's history includes its modern history, and that history is not always flattering to the civilization that considers itself the custodian of one of the world's great ancient sites. The question of who owns Stonehenge is one that has been quietly contested for decades. The monument itself is managed by English Heritage, a charitable organisation, funded partly by the British government and partly by the entrance fees paid by the 1.5 million tourists who visit each year. The land around it is owned partly by English Heritage and partly by the National Trust. But ownership, in the strict legal sense, is not the same as stewardship. And stewardship is not the same as understanding. For the indigenous peoples of Britain, if we can use that term with appropriate caution, the relationship to Stonehenge is not primarily one of ownership or management. It is one of inheritance, of a tradition that, however attenuated, connects the people of Britain today to the people who built the monument. The Druids who gather at Stonehenge for the solstices are, as noted earlier, a relatively recent invention. Modern Druidry was largely created in the 18th century, with significant contributions from figures like John Aubrey and William Stukeley, who studied Stonehenge not just as archaeologists, but as people who believed they were recovering a lost spiritual tradition. They were wrong about the history. The Druids of antiquity, the Celtic religious specialists described by Julius Caesar, had no connection to Stonehenge, which was built more than 2,000 years before the Celts arrived in Britain. The modern Druids who gather there are not continuing a tradition. They are creating one. But this does not make their relationship to the monument invalid. The question of what Stonehenge means to the people who live in its landscape today is separate from the question of what it meant to the people who built it. Both questions are legitimate, and the answer to the second question, what it means today, is complex and evolving. For many people, Stonehenge is a symbol of British identity, of deep roots in a land that was inhabited and loved long before recorded history. For others, it is a spiritual focus, a place where something real can be felt. Whatever the historical accuracy of the specific tradition in which that feeling is expressed. For archaeologists, it is the most important prehistoric monument in the world, a site of inexhaustible complexity that continues to yield new understanding. For the 1.5 million tourists who visit each year, it is a thing they have seen pictures of and wanted to see for themselves. And the experience of standing near it, not inside it, the stones are roped off from general access most of the year, is variable, sometimes disappointing, sometimes unexpectedly moving. The monument holds all of these relationships simultaneously. It does not belong to any single one of them. Let us return to the underground, because there is something beneath Stonehenge that has not yet been mentioned. Something found not by modern survey technology, but by the oldest kind of archaeology, excavation with a trowel. In 1978, archaeologists excavating inside the monument found, at a depth of roughly 1 meter below the present surface, a layer of material that was distinctly different from the chalk rubble and soil above it. It was a layer of fine, dark soil, rich in charcoal and organic material, that extended across a significant portion of the monument's interior. The material was analysed, the charcoal was dated. It came back to around 7,500 BCE, the same approximate period as the large timber posts discovered more recently. This layer of dark soil, rich in organic material, is evidence of sustained, intensive activity at this location in the Mesolithic period. Hunter-gatherers were not just passing through. They were spending enough time at this particular spot to leave a significant accumulation of charcoal and organic debris. What were they doing? The most common interpretation is that they were camping, a sheltered location, perhaps with a good view of the surrounding landscape, used as a seasonal campsite by groups of hunter-gatherers following the movement of animal herds across Salisbury Plain. But another interpretation has been proposed, one that is consistent with the later significance of the place. The site may have been a gathering point, not just a practical campsite, but a recognized location for seasonal meetings between different groups, for the exchange of information, goods, and mates, for the collective rituals that hunter-gatherer societies across the world use to bind dispersed groups into larger social units. If this is correct, then the significance of this particular location goes back further than any monument. The place was special before anyone built anything here. The gatherings and the rituals and the sense of accumulated meaning came first, and the monuments came later, as an expression of something that had been felt and practiced here for thousands of years before the first ditch was dug. The monument did not create the sacred space. The sacred space created the monument. There is a thought experiment that helps illuminate the scale of what we are dealing with at Stonehenge. Imagine you are standing in the center of a modern city, London, say, or New York. You know that this city has existed for roughly 2,000 years in its current general location. 2,000 years of history, of layers of building and demolition and rebuilding, of accumulated human activity. Now imagine that the city had been continuously inhabited and continuously modified for 5 times as long, 10,000 years, that the buildings and streets you see today are merely the most recent layer of a site that has been in continuous use since the last ice age. That is the timescale of Stonehenge. Not 2,000 years, but 10,000. Not the span of a single civilization, but of the entire history of settled human life in Britain. The depth of that history cannot be meaningfully comprehended in ordinary human terms. It exceeds the span of all recorded history. It extends back through every period we have a name for: Bronze Age, Neolithic, Mesolithic, to a time when Britain was still recovering from the last glaciation, and the people who lived here had no knowledge that the glaciers had existed. And throughout all of that time, this particular place was recognized, visited, and treated as significant. Not because anyone told them to, because something about it made it impossible to ignore. The thing that made it impossible to ignore was, at one level, geological. The natural alignment of the periglacial stripes, the way the landscape pointed toward the solstices, as if by design. But beneath that explanation, beneath the geometry and the astronomy and the chalk, is something that resists analysis. Some places are special, not because we make them so, though we do make them so, but before that, at a level that precedes human decision-making. The people who built Stonehenge were not the first to recognize this. They were simply the ones who decided to build something that made the recognition permanent. The Stonehenge that visitors see today is surrounded by a busy road. The A303 runs past the site at a distance of roughly 200 meters, carrying heavy traffic between London and the southwest of England. For most of the 20th century, the road ran even closer, within 100 meters of the stones, and there was a second road on the northern side as well. The visual and acoustic intrusion of modern roads on one of the world's great ancient monuments has been recognized as a problem for decades. Extensive plans for a tunnel to take the A303 underground, removing the road from view of the monument, have been developed, abandoned, redeveloped, and are currently, as of 2024, in a state of planning limbo, awaiting the resolution of various legal and financial challenges. The tunnel would transform the experience of visiting Stonehenge. It would restore something of the original relationship between the monument and the landscape. The ability to stand at Stonehenge and see, in every direction, the open chalk downland that the builders of the monument inhabited. But it would also require extensive excavation in a landscape that is now known to be archaeologically extraordinary. Every meter of the proposed tunnel route passes through a landscape that has been continuously used for thousands of years and that has been shown, by recent surveys, to contain far more buried features than anyone imagined 2 decades ago. The tunnel that would protect Stonehenge from the road might also destroy archaeological evidence of incalculable importance. The debate about how to balance the needs of heritage management, visitor experience, and archaeological protection is ongoing and will not be resolved quickly. It is, in miniature, the broader challenge of dealing with Stonehenge at all. A monument of such extraordinary significance, in a landscape of such extraordinary complexity, in a country where modern infrastructure and prehistoric heritage occupy the same ground, does not lend itself to simple solutions. When the first major excavations of Stonehenge took place in the 19th century, the excavators had no carbon dating. They had no geophysical survey technology. They had no way to analyze the isotopic profiles of human remains or extract DNA from ancient bones. They had trowels, notebooks, and considerable intelligence. Some of what they found they understood. Some of what they found they misinterpreted, and some of what they found they discarded, without realizing what they were throwing away. The bones from the Aubrey holes were studied briefly and then reburied. They were not systematically analyzed for what they could tell us about the people they came from, because the techniques for that analysis did not exist. When the reburial happened, in 1935, it was an act of respect for the dead. It was also, from the perspective of later generations of researchers, an act that made irreplaceable information inaccessible. Some of those remains have since been excavated again, more carefully and with better analytical techniques, but most are still where they were, reburied, beneath the grass inside the outer ditch of the monument, available in principle for future researchers, but not currently accessible. This raises a question that runs through the history of Stonehenge research. How do you balance the needs of the present with the needs of the future? The bones in the Aubrey holes contain information that we cannot currently extract, but that future researchers might be able to. Leaving them undisturbed preserves that possibility. Excavating them now gets information we can use, but may destroy context or material that future, better equipped researchers would have been able to exploit. There is no perfect answer. Every generation of archaeologists makes decisions that future generations will criticize. Every excavation involves some destruction. The goal is to maximize what is learned while minimizing what is lost, and to document so thoroughly that even what is disturbed leaves a useful record. The last thing to say about Stonehenge is also the first thing. Before there were stones, there was the landscape. Before there was the landscape, there was the chalk. Before there was the chalk, there was the sea. And before there was the sea, there was the slow accumulation of microscopic shells on the seafloor of an ocean that has long since ceased to exist. The stones of Stonehenge are made of this chalk, indirectly. The sarsen stones are silicified sandstone, hardened by silica, that was deposited in the chalk during a period when the sea retreated. They are the product of processes that took tens of millions of years. They have been standing in roughly their current positions for 4,000 years. 4,000 years is nothing in geological terms. It is a blink. The stones were there in the forms of scattered boulders on the chalk downs for millions of years before anyone thought to move them. They will presumably be there, if not here then somewhere, for millions of years after any human presence in Britain has ceased. What the builders of Stonehenge created was not permanent in any absolute sense. It is permanent only in human terms, which is to say that it has outlasted every civilization that has risen and fallen in the 4,000 years since it was completed. The pharaohs of Egypt have been dust for 3,000 years. The cities of Mesopotamia are buried under millennia of silt and sand. The empires of Rome and Greece and Byzantium are archaeological sites, studied by the same people who study Stonehenge. The stones are still standing, not because they are the most technically sophisticated thing ever built, not because the builders had access to knowledge or power that later civilizations lacked, but because they were built with care, with intention, with the specific goal of lasting. The people who built Stonehenge wanted it to be there when they were gone, when they got their wish. And beneath the stones, in the chalk, in the dark of the Durrington shafts, in the filled-in traces of the timber circles and the channels and the post holes of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, something else has lasted too. Not just physical evidence, something more than that. Something that resists easy description, but that everyone who has stood at Stonehenge, Even in the roped-off, tourist-circled A303 adjacent version of the experience, has felt the weight of accumulated time, not just human time, not just the 4,000 years of the monument or the 10,000 years of the site. The time before that, too. The time of the chalk and the periglacial stripes and the Ice Age. The time that the builders of the monument themselves could not have imagined, but that their monument seemed somehow to reflect. Something ancient was found beneath Stonehenge. It is older than civilization, older than agriculture, older than any human activity on this island. It is the land itself, and the people who built the monument understood something, that we are slowly, imperfectly recovering, that the land has a history, and that history is not ours to own or explain or fully comprehend. We can only acknowledge it. We can only, in whatever way is available to us, build something that points toward it. The stones point toward the sun, the shafts point toward the earth, and the avenue, running between them along the natural crease of the chalk, points toward both. That is the monument. That is what it means. And somewhere beneath it, still waiting to be found, the next discovery is already there. End of documentary. Extended segment. The science beneath the myth. There is a moment in the history of every ancient site where the mythology catches up with the evidence, and the two become impossible to separate. At Stonehenge, that moment happened a long time ago. By the medieval period, Stonehenge had already acquired the story that Geoffrey of Monmouth recorded in his History of the Kings of Britain around 1136, that the monument was built by Merlin, the wizard of Arthurian legend, who transported the stones magically from Ireland at the request of King Aurelius Ambrosius. Geoffrey was writing fiction that pretended to be history, as medieval chroniclers often did. But his account proved extraordinarily durable. It circulated across Europe, was repeated in chronicles and travellers' accounts, and shaped the popular understanding of the monument for centuries. In the 17th century, John Aubrey proposed that Stonehenge was built by the Druids. This was wrong for two reasons. The monument predated the Druids by roughly 2,000 years, and the Druids, as far as we can tell, did not build stone monuments. But Aubrey's proposal was influential and spawned a tradition that persists in modified form to the present day. In the 18th century, William Stukeley, who was both a serious antiquarian and a convinced druidomaniac, conducted detailed surveys of Stonehenge and the surrounding landscape that produced maps and drawings of considerable archaeological value. He also became one of the founders of the modern Druid revival, a movement he helped to shape by providing it with an ancient-sounding pedigree it did not historically possess. In the 19th century, the astronomer Norman Lockyer proposed that Stonehenge was a solar observatory, built specifically to allow astronomical calculations. He was right that the monument incorporated astronomical alignments, but wrong that it was primarily an astronomical instrument in any technical sense. In the 20th century, the most persistent myth about Stonehenge was that it was built by a succession of different peoples, each one unconnected to the previous builders, each one imposing their own meaning on a site they had inherited without understanding. This myth was partly a product of the limited evidence available, and partly a product of a tendency to see prehistoric Britain as a landscape of disconnected, isolated communities. All of these myths shared a common feature. They made the builders of Stonehenge less than they were, less intelligent, less connected, less cosmologically sophisticated, less capable of sustained intention across generations. The science of the last 2 decades has systematically dismantled each of them. The builders of Stonehenge were not primitive. They were not isolated. They were not incapable of sustaining complex projects across generations. They did not need Merlin or the Druids or any outside assistance, magical or otherwise. They were human beings, possessed of the full range of human intelligence and creativity and social organization, working in a tradition that extended thousands of years into the past. In a landscape they understood with extraordinary intimacy. The myth sold them short. The science is only beginning to give them their due. The acoustic properties of Stonehenge have been studied extensively in recent years, and the results are more complex and more interesting than either the enthusiasts or the skeptics expected. Rupert Till and Bruno Fazenda, working with a 1:12 scale model of the complete original monument and with computerized acoustic modeling, produced what they described as an impulse response of the original Stonehenge, a characterization of exactly how the complete monument would have modified sounds produced within it. The complete Stonehenge, they found, would have produced a reverberation time of roughly 0.6 seconds. This is similar to the reverberation found in small modern concert halls. It is not the cavernous echo of a large stone building. It is a warm, intimate reverberation that would have enhanced the qualities of voice and simple instruments produced within the monument. The lintels mattered critically to this acoustic effect. The continuous ring of lintels atop the outer sarsen circle created a partial enclosure that trapped sound inside the monument. Remove the lintels, as mostly happened when they fell or were removed, and the acoustic effect largely disappears. The circle of standing stones without their lintels is acoustically unremarkable. The complete monument was something different. This strongly suggests that the acoustic effect was known to the builders and was, at least in part, intentional. You do not engineer a specific reverberation profile by accident. The choice to cap the outer circle with continuous lintels, a technologically demanding achievement that required precisely cut joints and precisely positioned stones, produced a specific acoustic environment. What was that environment used for? Till and Fazenda proposed that the monument was designed for communal singing and drumming. The reverberation time and the frequency response they calculated would have been particularly favorable for human voice, enhancing harmonics and sustaining notes in ways that would have made any singing inside the monument feel different from singing outside it. There are accounts from ethnographic research into prehistoric and ancient ritual practices that describe the importance of acoustic environments in creating altered states of consciousness in ceremonial contexts. Repeated rhythmic sound, particularly drumming and communal chanting, in an enclosed or semi-enclosed space with significant reverberation, reliably produces subjective experiences that in many cultural traditions are interpreted as contact with spirits, ancestors, or divine forces. This is not speculation about what the builders of Stonehenge believed. It is a statement about the psychoacoustic effects of the environment they created. Whatever they believed was happening when they sang or drummed inside the monument, the physical effect on participants' experience was real and predictable. Stonehenge was an experience machine. It was built to make certain kinds of human experience possible. And the experience it was built to produce was not primarily visual. It was auditory. It was felt in the body before it was understood in the mind. The stones were a sound system, the most ancient sound system in the world. There is an aspect of the Stonehenge story that almost no popular account mentions. The monument was not always famous. It went through a period of relative obscurity. After the monument fell into disuse around 1500 BCE, it remained known. The Romans knew about it. Travelers mentioned it. It was by any measure a conspicuous feature of the landscape. But for roughly 1500 years, it was not a place of major pilgrimage or active religious significance. It was simply there. It was the Norman conquest of 1066, and the changes it brought to English culture and literacy that began to draw serious attention to the monument again. Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, written 70 years after the conquest, put Stonehenge back on the cultural map of Britain. From the 12th century onward, Stonehenge was a place that educated Europeans knew about and discussed. By the 17th century, it was attracting royal visitors. James I had the first systematic survey commissioned by the architect Inigo Jones. Charles II visited. The interest of royalty made it fashionable, and fashionable interest brought scholars. By the 18th century, Stonehenge was a standard stop on the Grand Tour, the educational journey through ancient and Renaissance sites that wealthy young Europeans undertook as part of their formation. Stonehenge was being compared, explicitly and implicitly, to the monuments of Greece and Rome. This comparison was usually made in a way that favoured the classical world. Stonehenge was impressive, but crude. Its builders were barbarians, however talented. The real pinnacle of ancient achievement was elsewhere. We know now that this comparison was based on fundamental misunderstandings of both Stonehenge and the societies that produced it. The builders of Stonehenge were not less sophisticated than the builders of the Parthenon. They were differently sophisticated. Their sophistication was expressed not in white marble and written philosophy, but in chalk and sarsen stone, and the precise geometry of a landscape that served as its own text. The history of Stonehenge's fame is itself an archaeological record. It tells us about the people who studied and visited and mythologized the monument in every period since it was built. It tells us about our own changing understanding of the past and our changing relationship to the people who came before us. And that history is as interesting, in its way, as the history of the monument itself. The discovery of the Stonehenge hidden landscapes has implications beyond Stonehenge. If one of the most studied prehistoric sites in the world, investigated by professional archaeologists for over a century, still contains major features that were unknown until the 21st century, what does that imply about other, less studied sites? The answer, which archaeologists are only beginning to grapple with, is uncomfortable. We probably know far less about the prehistoric landscape of Britain than we thought we did. The features revealed by modern survey technology at Stonehenge are not unique to Stonehenge. They are features that exist at other sites, but have not yet been looked for using adequate technology. Across Britain, there are hundreds of known prehistoric monuments. Each one of them is surrounded by a landscape that has not been systematically surveyed with the methods used at Stonehenge. Each one of them may be, like Stonehenge, merely the visible tip of a much larger and more complex site. The hidden landscapes approach, systematic high-resolution survey of large areas around known monuments, has been applied at a handful of sites beyond Stonehenge. At Avebury, the other great stone monument of Wiltshire, survey work has revealed dozens of previously unknown features in the surrounding landscape. At Durrington Walls itself, at sites in Scotland, in Ireland, in Wales, every survey has produced surprises. Not always surprises as dramatic as the Durrington shafts, but consistent evidence that the known monuments are embedded in richer, more complex landscapes than surface observation alone could reveal. The prehistoric landscape of Britain is not fully known. It is not even mostly known. What has been identified and recorded represents, in all probability, a small fraction of what is there. This is both humbling and exciting. Humbling because it means that a century of serious archaeological investigation has barely scratched the surface. Exciting because it means that the most important discoveries are still to be made. There is one final thought to leave you with. The title of this documentary poses a question. Something ancient was found beneath Stonehenge. It's older than civilization itself. That title is literally true. The features found beneath and around Stonehenge, the shafts, the timber posts, the Mesolithic charcoal layer, predate what we conventionally call civilization by thousands of years. The oldest activity at this site predates the first city, the first writing, the first metal tool, by 5,000 years. But the title also implies something that needs to be examined. The implication is that what was found is mysterious, perhaps threatening to our comfortable understanding of the past, Perhaps evidence of something that our existing frameworks cannot accommodate. This is where we need to be careful. What was found at Stonehenge is not evidence of a lost civilization. It is not evidence of ancient technology beyond the capacity of Neolithic farmers. It is not evidence of alien intervention or catastrophic events erased from history. These are stories that people tell about Stonehenge, and they are all, without exception, wrong. What was found is something more extraordinary than any of those things. It is evidence of ordinary human beings, over thousands of years, doing something remarkable with nothing more than intelligence, organization, shared belief, and enormous physical effort. They built a world, not a world of cities or empires or written records, a world made of chalk and stone, aligned with the sun, populated by the dead, defined by 2 miles of hand-dug shafts, sustained by generations of tradition that had no institutional support other than the tradition itself. That world persisted for longer than any empire. It outlasted everything that contemporaneous civilizations built. And the traces of it, preserved in the chalk of Salisbury Plain, are still yielding information about who those people were and what they believed and how they organized their lives. This is the real discovery beneath Stonehenge. Not a mystery, not a conspiracy, not a lost technology, an ordinary human achievement on an extraordinary scale. The most ancient and most human thing in the world